Okay, hello everybody. We're going to just be starting in just a second. All right. Okay, why don't we get going then? Hello and welcome to Rainbow Space Magic, or welcome back if you've been joining us for some of our previous panels today. I'm really excited about this next panel, which is called Defining Genres. Do we need to? So I think that's a very intriguing topic, and I look forward to hearing what our panel has to say about it. First, I want to say you're welcome to use the chat to talk amongst yourselves or to submit questions to the panel. If you do put your question in the chat, put a little question mark in front of it so that it's obvious. Otherwise, you can also use the Q&A function, which you'll find in the bottom on the bottom of your screen in the toolbar. After the panel, you can continue the conversation in the Discord. I'll put a link in the chat for the Discord if you haven't joined it already. And that's all from me. And now I'm going to turn it over to Kristen and the rest of the panel.
Well, welcome everyone. It is time to talk about genre. And we have a lot of thoughts already from our little pre-convention email chat. But I think the first thing we'll do is have everybody say hi and really briefly introduce yourselves really quickly, because if you're just in the reading, you have seen me already, so I won't talk too much. I'm Noone or Kristen. I'm published with JMS Books for the fantasy sci-fi romance. And in the day job, I teach college students about Shakespeare and monsters and medieval werewolves. And I'm also a member of the Robin Hood and Outlaw Studies Association, so ask me any random questions about Robin Hood and forest outlaws. And we'll just probably go in order. Erin, say hi.
I'm Erin Barbeau, and I'm a science fiction writer, Dilly clerk by day, entomologist by training, and my research currently focuses on the history of queer science fiction. So I'm really excited to talk about the history of the genre, but also how we use it as a common language for our readers.
Heather.
Hi, I'm Heather Flournoy. I'm a longtime editor, over 15 years at this point, I think, and I edit primarily queer fiction, lots of romance, lots of science fiction and fantasy, and I'm very happy to be here.
For those that we have a lot of different perspectives in here. This should be fun. Elle.
Hi, I'm Elle. I write sapphic science fiction romance and sapphic paranormal romance. I have 10 books out, and my most recent one is a murder mystery paranormal romance ghost story. So I like to mix my genres.
We'll talk about genre mixing. Lynne.
Hello, everybody. I am Lynne. I use she and they pronouns, so either will work. I am a full-time editor at Paizo, where I get to work on the very delightfully queer Pathfinder and Starfinder TTRPGs. In my free time, when I have it, I am a freelance game writer and consultant.
And we are missing Mark, I think, still at the moment, but if he pops in, he can come and join us. So the first of our talking points, which is actually rather a large talking point, so we're throwing you all into a deep end, but are genre definitions even useful? And if so, who are they useful for? Ourselves as authors, readers, publishers? Is it useful to define a genre?
Are we going round robin or whoever speaks first?
Go ahead and jump in.
Okay, well, I'll start it off, and I'm sure everyone's going to have comments. I find genre really useful for me as a writer because if you understand the genre you're working in, then you have access to a lot of tropes and shorthand that you're able to construct a story in which your reader will understand what's going on based on familiarity with the genre. So for me, that's where I find it useful, but I also find genre useful as a tool for relating works together in theme. They may not be necessarily within the traditional understanding of what speculative fiction is, but they share common characteristics. And this is sort of what I explore within my own research, that yes, we're looking at straightforward science fiction, but also, as some of the other panels have stated, they write romance or they like horror, and there's shared themes across these genres, that there's specific ways that we construct our stories or specific ways that we suspend disbelief. So that's sort of how I find genre important.
I'll jump in. I like genre expectations as a reader because I know what I'm getting into and I also know what to watch out for. I'm not a big horror reader, although I like to watch it. But if I see it on the page, it tends to be a bit much for me personally. I also enjoy it as a writer because then I get to play with all of them and break the rules and such. So I guess I appreciate their existence, but I wish there were a little bit more flexibility, especially when it comes to getting bought by one of the bigger publishers and also marketing. Those are I've been the victim of we don't know what to do with this, so we can't buy this from you. Um, so yeah, I mean it's got pros and cons, and I'm sure we're going to explore all those shortly.
I feel the same way about having genre be helpful for me as a reader, because even before we were in the unprecedented times that we are in right now, there are just certain things that I'm lacking the bandwidth for. I might enjoy them normally, but right now this is not the time for me to engage with certain types of stories. Um, so genre can help point me toward things that are more for me right now and things that are best on the TBR for a little while. And it does shape my expectations. And also, I think it's really fun to be then intentional about subverting those expectations on occasion, but doing it mindfully. So, so if I know I'm taking a little bit from this genre, a little bit from this genre, um, I know how to translate that in a way that makes sense, I hope.
I feel like that's sort of the follow-up question. Um, is genre limiting sometimes? Do we feel the need to go beyond genre limitations to go out there and break some of those limitations?
I think for me, the limitation is, like the others said, the markets that I can sell to necessarily. I primarily write short fiction. So, like, there's a wide, wonderful world of speculative fiction markets. However, when I start to get a little bit weird, that market sort of dwindles and dwindles. And I'm like, okay, I have to find someone who likes weird experimental things, but also someone who will pay, because literary magazines that are non-genre often don't, and I would like to be paid. So that's really, for me, one of the biggest limitations I find. And also, I also find in my own research that genre description on a label can be limiting, because it can remove an entire portion of data I'm looking for. For example, when I say I'm looking at science fiction history is separate from erotica history, because there's a lot of overlap, especially in the queer space, where the erotica can tend to get to be within the speculative fiction realm of settings, etc. So that's something that I'm like, well, one, it limits my data set, but also but also at the same time, there's this whole other world that there's a wall between, because we have this genre is this is how we're marketing it, this genre is this.
I think also too, um, I I would hesitate to say that queer fiction in general is um, separate from anything else, but you know, the literature was created so we had a place to go. So we could see ourselves in the characters, and we could craft worlds quite literally where we could exist in a certain amount of safety or control what happened to us, creating characters that we would be able to see in the literature. And so we're already a subset of fiction in general, and then breaking down what we're writing about or how we're writing about those themes, either cross genre or in specific categories, is even further limiting in terms of audience, Erin, as you were talking about, or saleability, profitability. You know, we keep shrinking the audience potentially in slapping a label on things while also wanting to hook our readership with those familiar themes and structures so that they can set their expectations to have the best possible experience to with a book that we present to them. So it's that interesting fine line where it's both limiting and freeing, I think, at the same time.
Oh, I actually love that idea that it's about helping the reader, right? That they get the best possible experience from this book, from encountering that book. I feel like that's a really lovely way to think about it, actually. Like these are tools for the reader. So is that something that we do when marketing books? And how does genre maybe help in terms of marketing or reaching out to readers or audiences?
I'll jump on this one. So one of the things that I found, while it can be very narrowing when you write sapphic science fiction, sapphic paranormal, it also widens the world in a different way, because I can go to all of the queer conferences. Sorry, my dog is barking and my earphones broke. I can go to all the queer conferences like GCLS and Read Out and all of those things and be welcomed and talk on panels. I can also go to Worldcon and my local science fiction and fantasy conferences and get on panels there. And so it gives me two different groups to try to sell my work to. And so, you know, it's got some advantages as well as having some limitations.
And I'll also jump on that because I'm someone who's done a lot of readers advisory, and I know for some people who are hesitant or picky readers, they really want books about people like them. So when I find a book that says, oh, it's queer, but also it's within a genre that I know this person likes. So say they like Star Wars or science fiction, it's a really great way to be like, here is your introduction to queer characters. I've been involved in a lot of fandoms that are primarily comprised of younger people who this is like their first foray into adult science fiction literature. So being able to have both the queer side of the marketing but also the genre side of the marketing has been really great for helping these people be like, I really like this, but I want to see people who are like me. But also at the same time, like Elle said, we can both go to, we have double dipping for conferences, which is really awesome because normally I do the traditional science fiction route, but if I have time, then I can double dip into other routes as well, which is awesome because it means you meet more people and you meet people with different perspectives and you get new perspectives as well.
And we've got Mark. We're sort of mid talking about marketing and whether genres are helpful in terms of marketing your work and getting it out there and finding audiences. But first, Mark, say hi. Um, we can hear you, but your audio is very, very high pitched. It's, oh, now we can't hear you. All right, we'll sort of let you sort that out.
No, it's
Oh,
okay. It should be okay now.
yes, we have got you. Say hello.
Hi. Like I said, fantasy and science fiction writer in Brooklyn. And I guess um, I've seen some particular writers fall into traps because their publisher picked the wrong genre to market it as. So there was one writer who had a very sort of dark fantasy that was gay, and they decided to market it as um, a romantasy. Um, and the problem is that the characters don't have a happy ending, and so a lot of people were not buying it as a romantasy. Whereas if it had been marketed as um, dark fantasy, it probably would have sold a lot better. So there's cases like that where it becomes a problem. When you're a publisher, you have to put something on the back of the book as far as what the category is, and you have to put it on the press releases. And what if they guess wrong, you know? So I'm actually sort of thinking maybe it's better if we don't tell people what it is and let them figure it out from the premise.
I think this is also a situation where you want to make sure you have an agent who is in your corner, especially if this is someone who's going to be handling how the publisher labels your work. Um, the best advice I've ever received about agents is talk to the other people who are represented by them, because just because they might also be queer like you, that does not mean they're going to stand up for your work. So I just wanted to add that onto Mark's example, because I've also seen this happen where some things are marketed rather interestingly or to a completely different demographic that I personally, if I had been the agent, I would have been like, no, this is not going to go there. Like, you need to put it elsewhere. So that's just a tip that I've picked up along the way.
I'd like to jump on that too, real quick. Sorry. But even if it is marketed correctly and labeled correctly on the book itself, like mine say science fiction, mine say paranormal. They don't actually say romance. Romance is the subplot. But when I found them at Barnes and Noble, they were shelved in romance. And I had to go to the manager and say, these don't say romance. They're not, but they're queer fiction. That doesn't necessarily mean. And that's something that I've run up against. And I have a wonderful agent, but she can't go to the bookstore and say, hey, you. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Elle. It's a matter of too many bookstore managers and shelvers, if they're not the managers, think of all gay books as being romances. And so if you're a gay fantasy writer or a gay science fiction writer or a gay horror writer or a gay slipstream writer, they're always going to tend to want to put you in the gay section and say, oh, that's romance, because it's talking about people's romantic and sexual interests as one of the identifiers.
It's such an academic problem too. One of the big conferences that I do with the professor hat on has sub areas that are science fiction or medieval literature, and then queer literature. And I've always looked at that every year and just been, well, what if you want to talk about queer science fiction? Which section do I apply to? Right?
I'm having that problem right now, actually. Um, do I go to a history department? Do I go to a literature department? I had to ask my friend who just completed a PhD, like, can you vibe check this department for me? So I think that's also like another really good point, because my research is very interdisciplinary. It's hard to be like, where do I go?
And it's something that if we're teaching students, because I've been trying, I just proposed that we have a romantasy course at my college, which because of, academic bureaucracy, probably won't get to teach for like 5 years. But we were just talking about it as something that students want. They're interested in these things, but it's something that there's weird resistance to. Like, this is non-canonical. This is not something that we should be teaching our students, right? I'm over here going, but I also teach Shakespeare. Like, can I do both? Right? Let's see. Heather, I know you've been, like, you have long time editing experience. So in terms of genre and maybe how useful that is, or in what ways does that help if you're editing something for an author?
Yeah, it's helpful and it's not, as I think most of the questions are going. in these panels. Romance has very specific reader expectations. If it's not a happily ever after or happily ever after for now, it's a love story, or it's general fiction with, romance as a subplot to something else. I think that I mean, when I think back to the history of queer literature, from the pulps all the way to the present, and how we have expanded what we are writing about. We started with our coming out stories. We started with um, seeing people end up in, I mean, remarkably not dying at the end of the book as some sort of morality tale. And as we populated our world through mail order and all of that with stories of people who ended up happy, often in a romance or a love story theme, and started to have a canon of books of our own, starting to think about stories outside of just these relationships and wanting to see them on the page. So being able to boldly and aggressively branch out into all genres of fiction is super, super important, both for our literature and our culture at large. So that said, as people are branching out and starting, and not even starting to, are have whole backlogs of their own, back catalogs of science fiction or fantasy or paranormal or horror, or any other genre category, starting to merge into these hybrid categories that encompass more than just one or the other, and finding ways to guide the author on these mixed genres is it's challenging for me as an editor, because I never want to suppress an authorial voice. But if you are coming to me with a story that looks like a space opera, romance in space, and one of the main characters, dies in the third act, um, that might be a problem to sell, or your publisher might have a problem with that, or you may find yourself with audiences that are angry at you, saying, you took me through 80,000 words of this spectacular love story, and then you killed them without giving me a hint that this was not going to have a happy ending. So it's uh, I know what the expectations are. The authors know what the expectations are, but we're continually pushing the envelope of stories that we want to write, that I think in mainstream fiction get more categorized into literary fiction, where they're pushing the envelope of how the genres can be stretched, incorporating elements of a lot of different things. But I feel like queer science fiction, fantasy, speculative fiction, they're all such vast canvases on which we can paint our worlds the way that we want to. So um, I'm always encouraging authors to push the boundaries as far as they want to, without, I mean, we've never been a community that wants to be held in by limitations and expectations. So I think our literature should reflect that. And I think our audience will go along with that. They have so far, at least.
Oh, I feel so optimistic.
Dale, I had a point about being what makes a queer fiction. One of the things that initially got me interested in this topic was I had a lot of people that were asking me on my social media, what's the minimum standard for something to be queer fiction? And there were a lot of people that were saying, if the characters in your story could be replaced by hetero couples, then it's not a queer story, because there has to be something either in the themes or in the identities of the people that makes them integrated into the plot. So in a lot of cases, the easy way to do that is to just have them be in a romance. And that's what gets us into some trouble with the genre sometimes, because our romantic and sexual interest determines part of our market. So what if we sell something that's not terribly romantic, but has some integral part of it that is definitely gay, like a culture where only men can be allowed in, or only women can be allowed in. Things like that start to make the gender and sexual orientation be part of the plot without having to resort to relationship drama.
So I can speak to this as someone who is asexual, but also I primarily deal with gender identity in my work since I am non-binary. So for me, a lot of my work is more character studies and personal studies. There's not really any romance in my own work because it generally is about finding community or being part of community. And in that aspect, when you move away from romantic and you have someone who is gender non-conforming as a character, it is easier to not have a romantic subplot, but also I feel like we need more stories where we have gay people who are just doing their everyday life and their romance is not the focus, because that is a big part of people's lives as well. This is something that I'm definitely seeing more and more of, especially since the 2010s, where we're getting a lot more works where yes, there may be some romantic plot, but it's not the focus, or maybe there's more works where this character is just coincidence that they are also bisexual, lesbian, gay, but it's more focused on their journey as a person. And I personally prefer this preference, but like I said, I don't write romance. I don't really read romance. I primarily read stuff that's marketed as nonfiction, science fiction, fantasy, speculative fiction, and a lot of memoirs. So that's something that I think is really important, especially when you're looking at genre is and representation, is how much of this representation is coming from what people assume we only care about and assume that we are one dimensional. And like romance is really wonderful. There's a lot of people out there who love it, and like my friend tears through every sapphic romance that she can get her hands on because it's her thing. But I think at the same time, even within romance, I like seeing these characters have rich lives, that is not just necessarily if you took away their love interest, that there's other things that make them a character. You know what I'm getting at, that it's not necessarily the genre itself, it's the character development that can also make something very queer.
Over the summer at the International Popular Romance Association conference, there was a real heated argument when someone proposed that the traditional romance happily ever after or happy for now wasn't actually necessary as long as there was a love story, and proposed Patricia Nell Warren's The Front Runner as a test case, which has a love story, they get married, they're happy, and then one of them dies. Would it count as a romance because there's absolutely a central romance and they're happy, but they're not together at the end, right? And people were angry. But it was an interesting idea. We were even asking that question, right? Could it open up the genre in different ways to different types of love stories, for instance? I feel like that's a good segue into one of our questions about both the challenges and also the excitement of writing things that cross genre boundaries, things that are slipstream, things that play with those combining genres. What are some of those challenges or some of the really fun things about it?
Well, I'm working right now. I just finished actually a new novel in my Novels of the Fae series. It's called Rabbit Dreams. It's about a 25-year-old gay Taiwanese computer programmer who's starting to have a relationship with a 40-year-old bi Chinese spy in Taiwan. And the rabbit god of Chinese folklore comes in to try to move this little relationship along. And so I have to have a hard time describing what the mood and the style of it is, because it's whimsical, it's mystical, it's written sort of in a magical realism way. The romance is a major part of it, but for the last half of the book, the two romantic partners are not together. They're separated. One of them has been abducted and taken to a secret Chinese prison. And the second half of the book is trying to get him back. So I'm still having problems trying to describe it to agents I'm submitting it to.
Maybe that's one of the challenges. How do I describe this thing?
I'm really excited by, I don't know, when we look at what are queer narratives, I see a comment in the chat by Sarah Grace. So what does it mean to have, a queer experience of life, right? How do we look at things? How do we experience the world? And it's not just romance by any stretch of the imagination. And, one of my favorite things that I read this year was Of Monsters and Mainframes, which I think it's a fantastic book. I love the book. Trying to envision essentially universal horror in sci-fi is an interesting challenge, but that's, you've got Dracula, you've got other notable figures on an interstellar trip, and shenanigans happen. Um, and it's marketed very clearly as a queer book, and there is queerness there, but I think a lot of readers wouldn't innately understand where that queerness comes from, what we mean by that, because it doesn't look the way that a lot of folks assume a queer romance or a queer story has to look. It's absolutely there. And the whole time I was reading it, I thought, I want this made into a movie. I want more people to experience this story because it's incredible. But I think in this case, the queer marketing of it may confuse some readers because of that expectation.
I do have something to comment because I also feel like there's a certain degree of, with certain works, you need to have a certain amount of media literacy that maybe some people don't have because they haven't read as widely or aren't as familiar with like the history of queer literature, etc., or how these works were influenced. Because like I said before, I've encountered this in different fandoms. I've been in the fandom discourse mine since I was a tiny child. But I noticed that, especially, like I said, when I was pretty active with the Locked Tomb series fandom, is that a lot of younger queers, they don't necessarily have this media literacy, sometimes because they don't have access to older queers or having like older queers hand down and say, we have a history with this work, this is why we see it as part of our canon. And I think that's something that is really fun about events like this and other events where there's younger people like me. I'm not that young, but I'm in my 30s, where I have people who are older than me who can hand down like, hey, this is what's part of our canon, and then I understand why something's marketed that way. And I think that's also something that's sort of important to consider with what do people know about the canon of this literature before you go in with a marketing of the genre or mixing the genre. Because right now, some of it is, there's a lot of people online, and it's really great because then you can start discussions about, hey, this is part of our history, this is how it ties in. Author's notes are really great for this. Shout out to every author note who's like, hey, I based it on this, this is how it's been used in the past. Like, I've noticed that in different queer works. I think These Hideous Progeny is a Frankenstein retelling, and amazing authors know about some history relating to Victorian queer relationships, but also how like Frankenstein is part of our culture via different things. And just to get back to the original question, I feel like genre mashing, when I'm working within science fiction or speculative fiction, I don't really have to care as much about making it believable as I do with other genres, because I can just be like, wish there was a warp drive, and I don't need to tell you how it works, but can we talk about, getting my gaze across the space to wherever they need to go? So I think for me, genre mixing is not something I think about. It's just, I know I'm writing a story with X thing, and I can be a little lazy here. I don't have to fill in these blanks. Whereas like if I was writing something contemporary, I'd have to think a lot harder to fill in blanks. Like, what are these people doing? How are they texting? Is this going to sound outdated in 5 years?
Mm.
So I just wanted to bring some of that in.
You're talking about hand waving, Erin.
I mean, as a hand wave away my entire screen.
I invented my own crossing space drive that I use in a couple of my different series. For me, pros and cons of mixing the genres, the most fun thing is when I'm at a science fiction conference and I meet queer people there and they're like, what do you mean there's queer sapphic romance and there's queer paranormal romance? They don't even, like, in many cases, they don't even know that there are entire publishers that are dedicated to, small press publishers that are putting out all these things. My small press publisher is a queer press, and they were so excited to get sci-fi sapphic romance and paranormal sapphic romance because it's just not as prevalent. I mean, it's there, it's out there, and you can find it, but it's not like pure sapphic romance where you can find it a lot of places. It was harder to get, and so they were really happy to get it. But as I mentioned earlier, on the flip side, with the big four or the big five or however many there are now, um, when we took it to them, one of the books I had, the book that they took, I think all the way to the board was Old West zombie time travel romance, sapphic romance. And the editor, I won't name the editor or the publisher, but she loved the voice, she loved the book. She's like, "What else do you have? Because I have absolutely no idea how to market this." Which is really hard to hear, when you know you did it right. But you didn't quite do it right for them. And it went to a small press and it came out, but it was kind of, it was upsetting at the time. So it made me almost, not quite, almost not want to do that again. But then I wrote 5 more that were cross genre, so I guess it didn't stop me.
I have an example. Christopher Rice is a fairly successful gay author, and he's the son of Anne Rice. So he has, like, on occasion, written vampire books. And if you want to try to find a way to make the gay part of the cast not matter, it's to get a really flashy crossover, like gay vampires. It's going to go as vampire stuff. It's not going to go as gay. That's one way. I think the other thing that some people have started to do, and I read his novel called Decimate, and it's interesting that he sort of makes the gay elements sort of assumed. They're not obvious. So that's another way to sort of hide the gay enough to have people identify it, but not to make it part of the book marketing.
I was thinking about trying to explain the paper I was writing on Everina Maxwell's Winter's Orbit, which I love, to a bunch of science fiction scholars and people who sort of came up through academic science fiction. Like, well, it's queer space opera, but we don't spend a lot of time on the science. Really, it's a her comfort story, and also at one point they have to literally huddle for warmth, and gender is indicated by what you wear, and nobody assumes anybody's gender. You have to look at what their fashions are to figure out their pronouns.
Did you
can just
mention
see,
Le Guin to
yeah,
them?
like there's such a long history of this. But then it gets really hard to explain to people. I'm like, you study science fiction? Well, maybe, but not the science fiction you're thinking.
I find Le Guin makes everyone be like, okay, yes, I understand now. She's my magic word when I'm like, I want to do this. Have you heard of Ursula Le Guin?
Oh, we have a question in the chat that should we talk about the influence of Amazon on authors and genre? It's sort of the big elephant in the room, as it were. How do you put your book on Amazon? How do you market it? How do you do ads? Things like that.
I think one of the things that's most interesting about Amazon as an author is that I look at my books and my publisher has keyed them in as being of certain genres. They don't have to pick just one, so they pick several. And so I get these listings in my Amazon books listings where it says I'm number 14,000 best-selling paranormal fiction. I'm 1,300 best-selling science fiction. Um, just all these different categories that I had no idea people were looking at my book through this particular lens.
Which is nice in terms of audience and discovering different audiences, but sometimes surprising. I didn't know my book was this. But for better or worse, there's those Amazon sort of expectations and keywords and things that you get associated with.
I think this is where using platforms like what is it? Oh God, it fell on my head. The reading logging platform that's not Goodreads, the alternative that's better.
The
Um,
Storygraph.
Storygraph. I really like Storygraph because it tags by genre, but also the readers can assign different tags to it, and it sort of compiles it all in the profile of a book. So if you can get your stuff on Storygraph, that's really fun to see how your readers categorize it. Because I know for me, when I'm on Storygraph, I'll just click a tag and see what else is in there. And I might not even be looking at the genre. I'm just like, oh, I like stories that feature XYZ. And I found that to be a really cool way to find stuff. And I kind of wish there was more ways to do that in selling platforms. I know in my library system, there's some of that going on with the librarians making lists, but I'm primarily short fiction, so I'm just hoping someone goes and reads the magazine. But yeah, so I have to shout out to Storygraph for doing the fun tags like hurt to comfort and stuff like that if you're looking for a different way to have your book shared.
I was also thinking about how for people that like to browse books, Amazon is very good because often they'll get to read 3 or 4 of my chapters for free. And I think that's a very good marketing technique for people that like that. They also make the back cover copy part of the main uh, program or main page. So I think they do a really good job as far as the packaging and marketing for people that browse books in different ways. And I always tell people you can read the first 4 or 5 chapters for free on Amazon if you want. And that's a very good way to market, I think, as well. Because if you have, especially if you have problems with people not understanding your genre, I think in the first 3 or 4 chapters, it becomes pretty obvious to the reader what sort of take you have.
And I'll just give us our little 6-minute reminder if you have questions. Now is a good time to drop them in the chat or the Q&A if you're in the audience and there's something you want to talk to us about. I was also wondering, sort of off the back of that, how do we feel about the rise of tropes as marketing, especially all those micro tropes, there's only one bed, or friends to lovers in space, or all those fancy graphics with the little book tropes. Do we feel like that's been helpful? Does it make things more complicated in terms of genre and what readers expect?
I think tropes are a tool. That's sort of how I look at them. You can use them for good, you can use them for evil. The power of the trope is in your hand. I think making your story entirely around tropes is a mistake, but being able to pick out a trope or two after you've written it and using that to maybe find comp works or be like, hey, if you like this, you can, like Mark said, you can read like a couple of chapters of my book on Amazon, and I promise there's more fun, delicious stuff like this. So I do think those infographics, just coming from a reader's advisory point of view, are helpful, especially when we're talking about people who are picky readers or aren't big readers, but they want to hop on like what people really are into right now. And like a lot of people my age, they want to know if they're gonna have friends to enemies or whatever in the book. I personally am more interested in other items, but I've found like a lot of my mom's coworkers who are my age, she comes to me and tells me what they're reading, and I'm like, oh yeah, XYZ. Recommend them this because if they like Sarah J. Maas, then they'll like this because there's this trope in there. And I have to say, it's really useful when you're looking at a younger demographic, maybe not as many people who grew up on AO3 and ye old fandom, but that's sort of my feeling on the trope. You can also use it for evil, break that trope, make your readers disappointed, but
It's responding to Dana. The trope maps that you see in social media a lot of the time, that started out as a YA thing exclusively, and it's become adopted by a lot of romance art writers. It's pretty much stayed with romance writers. I don't think it's bled into very many other genres right now, because the tropes, for the most part, are useful mostly to reviewers, and as Erin said, also to some readers. But I don't think they're useful for marketers or authors.
Agreed. I would say that the genre expectations are still there, so the authors still need to at least attempt to meet those genre expectations. But as a reader, yeah, I love the tropes and the identity. I mean, if you tell me that something has a trope that I love, I will read any genre that contains that particular trope. So if you can get yourself cross-listed, it can be extremely useful. Yeah.
Oh, that's so interesting. They're useful in different ways, it seems like. It can be any genre, but if it has this trope, I want that particular thing. Right? And it might be science fiction or fantasy or romance or all of the above. We've had about 2 minutes. Yeah. We're thinking about TV tropes in the chat there and the ways that they're tools for a creator to express what their work is doing.
Yeah, I find it happens much more often in screenplays. There's much more talk about tropes there. You expect that every script is going to have a trope in it, and you have to identify it in order to know how to market it.
Oh, Sarah's got an interesting question. Do we feel like this is also true for short fiction, that's how we market short stories and shorter works?
so I can speak to this a little bit since, like I said, I primarily do short fiction. When I do short fiction, if there somehow is a trope in my work that is popular, you bet my butt I am going to go ham on the memes, ham on the trope, and scream to the world about it because I want people to read my short fiction. It is unbelievably hard to get people to read short fiction unless it's available free online. And I unfortunately have only been published in print publications or subscription-based publications. So for me, if there's a trope there or a meme I can yell about, it's great. My friend Isabel J. Kim, like a lot of the marketing for her short fiction is also like, I have this trope in here, or let's make a meme about this trope that's in my story. And that's sort of how they've managed to garner more attention. Besides that, they're just a really awesome writer. Like every time Iz has a new story out, I'm like, damn girl, how did you think of that? I wish I did. But I think like on like Blue Sky, I find it really useful for just like sort of distilling down without revealing what the actual plot is.
Yeah, I think if you're marketing to publishers or magazines for short fiction, you're more likely to sell them based on the genre considerations as less than on the tropes. Um, and it usually comes out through the premise. Um, I think when I've marketed my short stories to magazines, mostly they just want to know if it's science fiction or fantasy on the general level.
Yeah, that's
They
usually the
might
first step is
the,
when you're submitting. I'm talking about like post submission when it's been published. That's where I start to
yeah,
get
yeah.
to it. Yeah.
But there's a certain amount of uh, further grinding down it that it happens. I think also that there will be some people that are specifically looking for something dark or something that's more solar punkish or something like that. So I think uh, there gets to be a point where it's important, but like you said, it's mostly after the publication.
And we are at time, although that feels like a good ending point and an answer to the question that was the title of this panel, which is, defining genres? Do we need to? And the answer still seems to be yes, right? We still want those definitions and they are still useful for everyone. So thank you all for coming, and I will turn things back over to Monique.
Thank you all. That was just a really fascinating discussion, and I really appreciated everybody's contributions to that. I really enjoyed it very much. And thank you all in the audience for joining us today. This is it for today, although there will be a casual Zoom meeting hangout if anybody wants to attend that. The link will be in the Discord, and the conversation does continue in the Discord. The next panel will, of course, be tomorrow at 9 a.m. Pacific, 12 p.m. Eastern, and it is writing about the past as a way of talking about the present, which I am very much looking forward to listening to. So thank you all and good evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.